Mr. President, the senator from Maryland said that he intends to raise a point of order objecting to this War Powers resolution because we do not have service members in harm's way. We do not have active hostilities, which is what is required by the War Powers Act. That is a creative procedural argument. It just has the inconvenient fact of not being true. And not only is it not true, but what the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is arguing to this body is directly contrary to the explicit position of the Biden Department of Defense. I want to read to you from a press briefing from the Biden Department of Defense on May 16th. A reporter asked the official spokesperson for the Department of Defense, question, quote, "The USAID spokesperson said yesterday that he wasn't satisfied yet with the deconfliction arrangement yet. And then he added that the maritime corridors exposed to, we do not think the JLOTS of the maritime corridor is exposed to any additional risk above and beyond that which is already present in Gaza." That's pretty frightening now, isn't it? Given how many people have been killed. Answer, and this is from the Biden Department of Defense, quote, "I don't think we've come up here with rose-colored glasses and said, this is not a risk. This is an active war zone." The Biden Department of Defense has explicitly stated this is an active war zone, that they are putting U.S. personnel at risk. And that is precisely what the War Powers Act gives this body the ability to act. I would note as well, my friend from West Virginia said he wanted a sense of the Senate, but not to use the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act is a way for Congress to exercise its prerogative. Over recent decades, we've seen the Senate hand away much of our responsibility on foreign policy and national security to the executive. That is contrary to the design of our Constitution, and it's frankly harmful to the Senate and harmful to this country. We are not merely a body that has a sense of the Senate. Look, I assume I will join whatever sense of the Senate. If it says this is a dumb idea, I'll join that. But while we're at it, we ought to rename a post office. The Senate exists to do more important things than make general musings into the ether. The Senate has the constitutional power, and under the War Powers Act, the legal and statutory power to say, stop spending money to send U.S. servicemen and women into harm's way. Now, far too often, the Senate has stepped out of our historic role in foreign policy, has said whatever the president wants, we, the Senate, aren't going to say anything about it. When there's a Republican president, Democrat senators suddenly discover their voice and say, hey, the Senate ought to say something. But when it's a Democrat president, it seems no matter how incoherent and disastrous the foreign policy from the Democrat president, Democrat senators don't want the Senate to exercise its authority. I'll reiterate the offer that I made just moments ago to the staff of the Senate Majority Leader. I will withdraw this War Powers resolution if the Senate votes on the legislation that has already passed the House to provide the weapons that the Biden White House is blocking to Israel. The Democrats don't want to do that because they don't want their members on record. And because they don't want their members on record, this is the only vehicle I have. Because procedurally, under the statute, I have a right to force a vote on this. Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee said they're not active hostilities. The Biden Department of Defense has explicitly disagreed. To quote again, I don't think we've come up here with rose-colored glasses and said that this is not a risk. This is an active war zone. That means the War Powers Act fully applies. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maryland.
There is no dispute that there is active hostilities in Gaza. That's not the issue. The question is whether American troops have been engaged in that hostility, and they are not. That's when the War Powers Act is triggered. American presence through missions are common in areas surrounding active hostilities. That is not unusual. So the use of the War Powers Act in these circumstances would be unprecedented. And I would urge my colleagues to recognize there are other ways we can express ourselves. I thank Senator Manchin for giving us that opportunity, but this is the wrong procedure to use. And if all time is yielded back, I yield the floor.
A very brief response
Senator
to what
from
my
Texas.
A very brief response to what my friend from Maryland said. The pier was fired upon twice. It is difficult to say that we're not in active hostilities when we are being fired upon. And so it clearly falls under the statute. And with that, I yield all further time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
In brief rebuttal, I would tell you a mission dealing with humanitarian assistance is not introducing our soldiers. Mr. President, I make a point of order. I yield back our time, and I make a point of order that this joint resolution is not entitled to privilege under 50 U.S.C. 1546A due to U.S. troops not being engaged in hostilities. Yeas and nays.
The chair submits the question to the Senate for its decision. Is the point of order well taken?
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin,